Hello and welcome to the final part on my Tiger 1. In this video I'll do the painting and weathering. Before I can start adding any of the camouflage colours, I need to spray a layer of primer over the entire model. This time I'm using Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black. Previously I have always used Tamiya XF1 Black as a primer, but the Mr. Surfacer is much better. After it dries the paint is much smoother and you can see more of the texture. Next I start adding the camouflage colour. Like I mentioned in the last video, I'm trying to replicate the French Tiger 1 Colmar, so I need to paint it in olive drab. For the first layer, I combined Tamiya olive drab, flat earth and buff, but I thought it was too light and not green enough, so I went over it again with the addition of olive green. Once the first camouflage layer had dried, I added post shading with NATO brown and black around all the details and panel lines. Then I used a 0.2mm airbrush to add a very fine layer of a lighter shade of the base colour. This was mottled over the entire model. I tried to blend the post shading into the base colour and add variation to it so it isn't completely flat. Now I sprayed over a couple layers of Vallejo gloss varnish. This is to protect the paint layers underneath and to create a completely smooth surface for the decals. The kit has options for several different tigers. I think the detail of these decals is very good. They look like they have been hand painted instead of looking too perfect and unrealistic. Before adding the decals, I apply Mr. Mark Setter in the area where I plan to put it. Then I slide the decal onto the model and move it into the correct position. Once I'm happy with the position, I leave it to dry for a bit, then I add a few layers of microsol until the decal starts to wrinkle. I leave the decals for 24 hours so that they are completely set, then I add a layer of gloss varnish over them. Next I use a lighter shade of the base colour to paint some of the small details like rivets and bolts. Then I spray a couple layers of Vallejo satin varnish over the entire model. I create a mud textured paste from pigments, water, thinner and silica sand. This is applied to the lower hull and blended with water. I try to put the mud in places where I think it would accumulate. Now I spray 2 layers of Ammo Scratches Effect chipping fluid over the entire model. Once it has dried, I spray a light layer of dust coloured paint over the mud, the sides of the hull and around the details of the top of the tank. Then, using a brush moistened with water, I activate the chipping fluid and remove some of the paint. For the tracks, I randomly spray dark brown paint, trying to vary the amount on each link. Then I use the same dust paint mixture that I used on the hull and again sprayed it randomly over the tracks. Once the airbrush dust layer has dried, I spray a couple of layers of Vallejo satin varnish to seal it all in. Then I use enamel paints to apply a pin wash over all of the bolts, panel lines and other details. After leaving the pin wash to dry for a couple of minutes, I remove the excess with a cotton bud. The next step is to add the chipping. To do this I used Vallejo acrylic paints, specifically the lime green and khaki. The colour should just be a lighter shade of the base colour. First I use a sponge to add chips to the whole vehicle, focusing in areas that are more likely to be chipped. Then I use a very fine brush to connect some of the small chips and add extra where I think it's necessary, such as around the hatch corners. Now I use Vallejo black grey and hull red to create a dark rusty steel colour. I use the same fine brush to paint it inside some of the lighter chips. To paint the tools I also used Vallejo paints, this time making a light wood colour from wood, tan earth and buff. The steel colour was made with black grey and basalt grey. And for the wire cutters, I painted the handles a dark red colour made from hull red and black grey. I painted some of the wooden parts different shades of the light brown colour to add some variation. For the metal tools, I wet blended some different shades of grey so that the colour isn't completely flat. With dark brown oil paints I added a wash over the wooden parts and also added shadows in the corners and edges. I also used rust coloured oil paints, randomly dotted over the metal parts and blended with odorless thinner. The machine gun barrel and rear convoy light was painted with dark grey acrylic paint. I used wet effects to add the shiny glass effect to the light. Wet effects were also used on all of the vision boards. The kit also includes a decal for the fire extinguisher. This was added in the same way as the earlier decals, but without using any varnish. For the exhaust, I first sponged on white acrylic paint in the areas where rust would accumulate. Then I wet blended the same white paint over it. After this, I used a very fine brush to add the dark steel chips. The exhaust were then glued in place, to be finished later. Now for the spare track links, I started by spraying them a couple different shades of grey, then randomly used a sponge to add lighter and darker shades of grey. These were then also fixed in place. Next, I wet blended a few rust coloured oil paints onto the spare tracks and exhaust. Later, I will finish the exhaust by adding the smoke effect. After this, I went back to the lower hull and started adding the mud colours. For this, I only used enamel paints. I painted a light dust colour over all of the textured mud that I added earlier, and blended with a flat brush and odourless thinner. I moved the brush in a vertical motion to create some streaks. I then speckled on dried mud splatters with a brush and stick. Next, I used a dark mud colour on the inside of the dried mud. I'm trying to make the centre of the mud look wet and gradually look drier towards the edges. This was again blended with odourless thinner. I found that the first dust colour was too light and didn't look good against the dark camouflage of the tank, so I combined the dark mud and the dust colour to make a medium brown colour and went over that dust colour again, using the same techniques as before. I used a cotton bud dipped in steel coloured pigment around the edge of the wheels. These were then fitted onto the tank. I used more of the same enamel paints and blended dried mud coloured paints randomly. I wanted to keep the mud and dust effects light, so I didn't use too much paint here. After this, I speckled on some of the same enamel paint mixture to represent dried mud splashes. I covered the hull with paper as I only wanted to paint the wheels at this point. Earlier I had forgotten to add the mud texture to the tracks, so I added it here using the same recipe as before: pigments, silica sand and water. This mixture was put onto the recesses of the tracks, blending with water. Again, I keep the amount of mud low and try to wash off most of it from the raised parts. Using a pencil, I created marks where the wheels would have been touching the tracks. Next, I used thinned dust-coloured enamel paints and went over the textured mud, applying the paint randomly. I also speckled the same mixture onto the inside of the tracks. Finally, to finish the tracks, I used a cotton bud with the same metallic pigment to add the steel texture to the raised parts of the tracks. Any excess was blown away. I carefully fitted the tracks into place and glued them with super glue. Having workable tracks would have made this much easier. Again, I added mud splashes with enamel paints, this time onto the side of the hull. I used more of the same enamels to add extra dust onto the top of the tank. This was put all around the raised areas and then blended with odourless thinner. To finish, I added smoke effects with black pigment powder around the top of the exhausts. Now the French Tiger 1 is completed. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, then please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel.